Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Building the Future of Cannabis Clinical Trials Using Real-World Evidence. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself as the moderator for today's panel. My name is Dr. Lauren Kelly. I'm a pharmacologist and assistant professor at the University of Manitoba. I'm also a mother to 2 toddlers and a first-generation academic, and I come to this work with more than a decade of experience in maternal child health drug safety research. I have the pleasure here in Canada of leading C4T, which is an academic research network that has come together to develop and share evidence on medical cannabis research with children. I want to acknowledge that our home is on Native land, and I myself am joining you today from Treaty 1 territory in central Canada, which is homeland of the Anishinaabe Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge that the water that my family drinks and keeps us clean and hydrated is sourced from Shoal Lake. Our panelists today and participants are joining us from all over the world. We have more than 100 registrants from all sorts of different countries, and I'd like to invite you to learn a little bit more about the people who live on the land before you and pay attention to the impact of the colonial systems that continue to oppress Indigenous and marginalized people where you live. You can learn more about the land where you're currently living at nativeland.ca. With that, I'm thrilled to welcome today a diverse panel of experts across Canada, Europe, and the UK to talk about their experiences with cannabis and in talks about clinical trials and using real-world evidence. And just in case you signed up for a free webinar about cannabis and aren't too sure what brought us all together today, we'll go through a quick introduction that should take about 10 minutes, and then I will welcome our panelists and we'll begin our discussion. Just the lay of the land, this is a live webinar and it will be recorded and available on YouTube after the session. In order to ask questions, we ask that you can put them directly into YouTube. You can also ask questions on Twitter or on Slido. So if you do not have a YouTube account or a Twitter account, Slido is your best option there. You don't need to log in. You can just put in that hashtag and ask your question. I want to first start with a few terms and just some definitions to discuss the differences between randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, and real-world evidence, or RWEs. So randomized controlled trials are controlled experiments. They have a highly selected patient population, generally those that we think will benefit and not likely be harmed by this intervention. There's usually one specific product or maybe 1 or 2 products that we're looking at, as well as a control arm. They have what's called high internal validity. We hear this word because they have a very strict protocol. So randomized controlled trials require patients and doctors to follow a very strict study protocol that might look a little bit different than routine care. Generally, these have lower external validity, and that means how generalizable clinical trials are. So what we learn in clinical trials, how does that reflect what we see in the real world? And how can we learn or generalize the experience from trials? And RCTs really ask an important question of, can this drug work under optimal conditions with just the right patients? Is there any potential for this drug to cause benefit or harm? Real-world evidence is really any kind of evidence that's generated from clinical data. So this includes diverse populations, really any kind of patient that could be seen in a clinic. There's a wide variety of treatments that are studied in real-world evidence. It has lower internal validity, so it doesn't have the same kind of structured protocols that randomized clinical trials would follow. It more reflects routine care. And this gives it high, what we call external validity. And that means it's easier to generalize what we learn from real-world evidence because it better reflects what's happening outside of the control of a clinical trial. And it really answers the question of, in the real world, does this drug work? Now, RCTs have a lot more, because they have these protocols, they have a lot more strict monitoring, and they have a lot more regulations behind how they are conducted. But these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive terms. And so when we look at like the evidence pyramid of, how evidence-based medicine works, we look at randomized controlled trials as really the gold standard for how clinicians and doctors and nurses make decisions about healthcare treatments. And again, they serve different purposes. So randomized controlled trials are essential for marketing approval. So this is how drugs get drug identification numbers and marketing authorizations. This is how drugs get on formularies for reimbursement. This is how drugs get into clinical practice guidelines. So someone like myself might come along and do a meta-analysis and only include clinical trials. And that leaves out all of that real world evidence. Real world evidence is, again, the clinical evidence. So this can include all kinds of real world data sources. So RWD just means the data sources in the real world. These can mean anything from electronic health records, billing claims, registries, wearables, the Apple Watch on your arm. All of those kind of things are considered real world data sources. And if we look at kind of traditional drug development, we have a long process. There's 10 to 15 years of research. There's hundreds of millions of dollars that go into drug development. There's different checkpoints, so new drug applications, marketing authorizations, 3 phases of clinical trials before a drug is on the market. And, for cannabis, we're already at that blue box, right? Cannabis is already available, and cannabis-based medicines are available in many different forms. I'll talk a little bit about what's available here in Canada in terms of some of the products. And of course, cannabis has faced, this whole history of first it was on the pharmacopoeia to treat headache, and then the whole war on drugs and all of the stigma associated with cannabis. And it's a very complex plant, and I'm thrilled to welcome a very astute plant scientist to talk a little bit more about the complexity of the cannabis plant and how that fits into clinical trials and observational studies. And we know that there's lots of different active compounds. And so I think, I was at a talk last week where I talked about CBD really being every pharmacologist's nightmare, and that statement really holds true. There's lots of different products that are available, and of course they can be administered different ways, and this means that people are going to respond to them differently. So just speaking about what's here in Canada, on our wish list is Epidiolex. However, Epidiolex is not approved. Epidiolex is a 99% pure CBD that is approved for drug-resistant epilepsy in many places, but not here in Canada. And there are some families that do import it at a heavy cost. Sativex is one of the products or the pharmaceutical grade cannabinoids that is available and marketed here in Canada for multiple sclerosis spasticity. It does not have any pediatric indications, and this is a balanced product, so an equal ratio of THC and CBD. As of October 2018, here in Canada, we have recreational cannabis, a marketplace. So dispensaries, I think there's about 8 I could walk to from here. And the product supply is almost endless, everything from beverages to high concentration hash shatters. And then we also here in Canada have a medical cannabis stream. And these include products, again, a wide variety, and include a lot of CBD-enriched extracts. And just for those of you outside of Canada, or maybe who come to us today from the adult space, an important point is that because we don't have Epidiolex here in Canada, for children with drug-resistant epilepsy, the medical cannabis stream is currently the only legal route for children to access CBD in Canada. When we think about epilepsy, where we have some good data to support, using and data from clinical trials to support CBD, we look at the cannabis plant, and there's really, very, very, very few clinical trials that match up with all of these therapeutic potential indications. And so this is a reasonably old paper from Trends in Pharmacological Sciences looking at all of the different potential therapeutic benefits from cannabis compounds. And if you compared what you see on this graph with what you see in sort of the clinical trial landscape, you will see very, very few of these compounds studied for very, very few and specific indications. And so cannabis clinical trials, well, they follow the same framework and the same regulations here in Canada. They have different practices globally. So on top of how we would normally study a drug in clinical trials, we have to have a cannabis research license here, and that we'll talk about how that may differ in some of the other countries. One of the biggest challenges for us is that we have to conduct clinical trials with products that are produced by good manufacturing practices with preclinical data. Now, most licensed producers haven't had to study. I haven't had to put together preclinical data, and their products here are produced under what's called good production practice. So it doesn't meet those GMP requirements. And that means that I, as a clinical trialist, can't study products that people are using and accessing from the medical or recreational market. I can only study products that are made under GMP, which really limits what we're able to study. There's often conflicting interests, of course, within the cannabis space, as often many of these companies make the money on the recreational market. And so that can be viewed as sort of lumped in with alcohol and tobacco when it comes to funding and conflicts of interest with research teams. And of course, clinical trials are very expensive. They cost a lot of money and they take a lot of time to complete. And so the scientific and the medical and patient communities have a lot of questions about if and when cannabis-based medicines can help, if they are safe, if they are effective, and when regulators make decisions about marketing approvals or policies, and when doctors make decisions about the patients in front of them, and when scientists like me review and appraise evidence, and when patients and families are making decisions for themselves about whether or not they want to start cannabis or introduce cannabis into their existing regimen, what we don't want is this dichotomy between, well, there's no clinical trials, so there's no evidence. And so I think, in many therapeutic areas, we see that there are not clinical trials that guide care. And it's really more of an experience-based medicine, especially in pediatrics, where, most of the drugs we give kids don't have a marketing authorization, particularly here in Canada. And so the rules currently in place for clinical trials make a pragmatic trial difficult because, of course, we can't study the products that are being used in real time. And licensed producers haven't been incentivized really to invest and expand the infrastructure that would be needed to run clinical trials on medical cannabis products. And they're not incentivized to develop pharmaceutical agents. And, licensed producers, as I'm sure many of you are on the call today, acknowledging that you are, businesses and that necessarily don't maybe not have the expertise in clinical trials. And so that's where we really get this kind of tension between, well, we need clinical trials, but there's lots of real world evidence. And hopefully what we're hoping today is that we can really discuss some ideas on how to move research forward on cannabis-based medicines using both real world evidence to complement the design and conduct of clinical trials, to support regulatory decision making, to inform clinical care, and to advise on health policy for the use of cannabis as a medicine. And so that's just sort of an overview of where we're hoping to go today. And with that, I am thrilled to introduce our wonderful panelists. First up, we have Matt Hughes. Matt is the co-founder and director of MedCan Support, which is a hub for education, advocacy, research, and support in the area of medical cannabis use in pediatrics. Matt has been involved in the UK medical cannabis sector since early 2019, when his son Charlie was prescribed cannabis for the treatment of severe treatment-resistant epilepsy. Charlie has seen a dramatic reduction in seizures and much improved quality of life. And Matt continues to campaign and advocate for population-wide NHS access for children suffering from severe epilepsy. And he continues to be a voice for patients and families since joining the committee of the UK Cannabis Industry Council. So welcome, Matt. Next up, we have Dr. Callie Seaman. She is a plant scientist and formulation chemist with over 20 years of experience in the hydroponics industry. She's worked with a number of licensed producers in the UK and internationally as a director and researcher to help optimize and set up cannabis research programs. As a patient, she's passionate about educating everyone around medical cannabis and helping to support patients through their journey with cannabis prescriptions through volunteering with organizations such as MedCan Support and CLIA. Dr. Anna Schalg is a chartered psychologist and the head of research at Drug Science. She leads the research for Drug Science Medical Cannabis Working Group, focusing on controversies surrounding medical cannabis, the improvement of patient access, and the continued development of education and stakeholder communication about medical cannabis. Dr. Schalg is currently working on progressing the scientific evidence base for medical cannabis to include patient-reported outcomes and observational studies such as T21, which we'll talk about today, and the application of multi-criteria decision analysis to assess the benefits and safety of medical cannabis. She holds an honorary fellowship at the Imperial College of London and King's College London, and chairs the research group of the Cannabis Industry Council. And she is also a scientific advisor to the Primary Care Cannabis Network. Welcome, Dr. Schalg. Moving to our bottom line here, we're thrilled to welcome Alexander Repetski. Alexander is a media production artist and communication strategist, and his interest in medical cannabis began and became increasingly important in 2012 when his daughter Guinevere was diagnosed with intractable epilepsy. He came across the cannabis while researching various areas of neuroscience in an effort to understand different treatment options. And after repeated failures of several traditional therapies, he has successfully been managing Guinevere's seizures with specialized cannabis cultivars, extractions, and formulations. He's regularly asked to speak about his experiences to both cannabis patients and the academic world, and he has been in the cannabis industry working with data startups and various licensed producers for the last 7 years. Next, we welcome Dr. Jennifer Anderson, who is a mom of 3 and a family physician who works to advocate and educate about the role of cannabis in pediatric epilepsy. In addition to this, Dr. Anderson works as a consultant for other physicians to co-manage patients from across a variety of different ages to access medical cannabis. In the past 6 years, she's advocated to government, educational systems, and medical cannabis for change and removal of barriers for patient access, and has worked to help families all over the world navigate the medical cannabis system for their children. So welcome to Dr. Anderson. And finally, we welcome Dr. Bruce Crooks, who is a pediatric oncologist at IWK Health and an associate professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax. Originally from and trained in the UK, he has been in Canada since 2002, caring predominantly for children with cancer, particularly CNS tumors, patients requiring bone marrow transplant, retinoblastoma, and solid tumors. His interest in medical cannabis grew from the interest families had in using it for supportive and curative care, despite a paucity of medical information. He is interested in helping to determine the place of medical cannabis in the treatment of children, not only those with cancer, but for other medical conditions, and also in facilitating frank and open dialogue between families and healthcare professionals about medical cannabis. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen. And perhaps the first question, I spoke a little bit about to the products that are already available here in Canada. And so maybe Dr. Schalg, if you could speak to just sort of what's available in Europe and the UK, and how is this different than what we have here in Canada?
Hi, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lauren, for the great introduction. I think you had a really was an introduction to a lot of topics we're discussing in terms of real-world evidence versus RCTs. So absolutely excellent. And yeah, I was quite surprised hearing that, for example, Epidiolex is not available, not recognized, so to say, in Canada, because that's one of the few, unfortunately, only few medications which is actually recommended and acknowledged here by NICE and the NHS as well for treatment-resistant epilepsy, for example. So here in the UK, just to separate the UK and Europe, because that's quite different as well. Just speaking about the UK, we have through the NHS, which is our National Health Service here, which as well as a private service, and that varies quite tremendously. The National Health Service is what most people have, and we pay our taxes so that the National Health Service can provide these medications and treatments very reasonably. So private healthcare, on the other hand, one needs a private insurance, and it's quite pricey. So on the NHS, unfortunately, medical cannabis is still not very much recognized. It has been legal since the 1st of November 2018, so it's all fine to use it and to prescribe it, but really, ideally, NICE only recommends a prescription for 4 main conditions. This includes epilepsy, certain forms of it, MS, and spasticity related to it, and wasting disorders in relation to HIV, and cancer-related and nausea-related cancer issues. But for that, we only, the prescriptions that can be written are really on Epidiolex and Sativex, as well as dronabinol. So on the other hand, the private sector, that's not to say that these no other medications are not available, but one has to go through the private sector generally if one wants a particular full spectrum or a plant, a flower, and so on. So there are loads of options available. Unfortunately, and anything from oils and topicals and flowers as well. And capsules, of course, there's various ratios. Unfortunately, one has to go to the private sector, and this is still associated with very high costs, especially keeping in mind that a lot of these conditions medical cannabis is used for are quite chronic. So it's not a one-off, but it's for a longer period of time. So it's quite a challenge, and the prices have come down. There has been quite a bit of competition, which is good, I think, within the industry, but the prices are still too high for the majority of patients, and we're working really hard that they come down. And within this, which I hopefully will speak about later, is, for example, Drug Sciences Project T21, where we have been able to offer various, broad range actually, of medical cannabis products from private practitioners and industry partners at a very much reduced rate to patients if they join the project and consult to the data collection.
Europe is we'll talk about in a moment. So we'll talk lots about Project 21 today, because there's a similar observational study here in Canada too, and I think it's such an important area and key highlight. But just before we get into the specific studies, I wonder, Callie, in terms of clinical trials on cannabis, I spoke a little bit to sort of how they're regulated and the rules for them here in Canada. Is there anything different about studying cannabis in the UK compared to, say, studying, morphine or any other type of pharmaceutical?
Well, the biggest problem is a lot of them are not actually licensed medicines. We have no domestic supply in the UK, so everything is also imported. So we then have to get importation licenses in order to bring a product in and to keep that consistency in the product coming into the country. Now, if we're going down the route of actually being able to cultivate in order to do research on the plant, there is a whole different licensing procedure needed there. And then for a commercial license and not just research as well. So I think we do suffer with the same problems. I think availability is just a lot easier within places such as Canada and throughout Europe because there is a domestic supply available there. Schedule 1 licenses are still needed. So you still need those, like as you mentioned with morphine, you still need these highly regulated licenses, which unfortunately within the UK seem to take a long time in order to obtain these as well. Universities find it a lot easier than companies at the moment because they tend to already have Schedule 1 licenses and have their all the protocols in place to actually handle those substances. But actual clinical trials coming together, as Anne pointed out, that one of the best ones we've got at the moment is the Project 2021, which she will fill us a lot more in with later.
Wow, that's exciting. And so cannabis was scheduled. We had to do a controlled drugs and substances license here until the Cannabis Act. So now it's a whole different only cannabis research license. So same type of process, but with a different name on top. And so I wonder if we can talk a little bit about when we don't have clinical trials, because I think, most of us are from a pediatrics background and, we have very few clinical trials for a lot of different therapies. So not just medical cannabis. So I just wondered, and maybe this is a question, maybe Bruce, for you first, is so, when you're looking at a patient and you're making a decision about a therapy, any therapy, and you don't have clinical trial evidence, how do you make that decision? And maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of that uncertainty and how you navigate it. And what's different about cannabis?
Oh, absolutely. All this is a challenge. In the world of clinical medicine, we have a whole load of pharmaceuticals, etc. Each of one has a license to actually treat something. In pediatrics, we've had a very, very long history of actually using a lot of adult medicines in children who we don't actually have a license for, but we know that there is an indication for it and there is a lot of drug information and drug data there. And so we use our expert opinion to be able to do that. And there are levels of evidence that we go through. And as Lauren was saying, we start with the randomized controls trials, which is the epitome of classical clinical research, right the way down to just sort of single case studies where we've tried it in a single patient and it seems to have worked. And so we publish that and that information goes there. With cannabis, we know that cannabis is medicinal. It's been medicinal for many, many years and for centuries. The problem is for most of the 20th century, when everything else was getting investigated, cannabis was left behind. Even opium was investigated, even though it's probably much more serious a drug with heroin and all the variety of opiates that we have. It was still investigated and it's still being researched so much more than cannabis. So we're left with a plant extract which is a natural product in Canada without any pharmaceutical license and very, very little research there. And so we have to rely on a lot of the sort of the anecdotal evidence. So those are the stories that people tell. Everybody knows there's a story of Uncle Joe who smoked cannabis for years because it helped with his pain in his knee or whatever else it is, and everything else. And so that's kind of, I think I have a term for it. It's called folk medicine because it's there in the folklore. And I think there's a huge amount of evidence there that we haven't necessarily tapped into, but we really need to. The problem is sifting out what is the good evidence from the weird and wonderful evidence and the claims that everybody comes from. So, I mean, again, we have to use what evidence we have. We have to use our common sense. We have to use our clinical expertise, and we have to use the expertise of those around us. And I'm very used to phoning up a friend or emailing a friend to ask their opinion about something, even in something as complicated as the cancer field. And there is so much drug development going on that we have on one side, and then there's cannabis on the other side, which most likely and probably does have an indication and a lot of use, but exactly where that's going to lie, we don't really know yet. And there is so little evidence out there that any of us physicians can actually tap into at the moment that it's so difficult to do so. But we're actually trying to teach each other and to learn from everybody around us, like Matt and Alexander, et cetera, et cetera. So they're teaching us, and that's where our evidence is coming from right now.
Yeah. And Jen, did you want to add as well as, you know, when you're seeing, because obviously you see patients for a whole bunch of different indications, you know, as opposed to Bruce, who's seeing, you know, mostly kids with cancer. Can you speak to sort of how you make those decisions and how that would differ based on the kid that's sitting in front of you?
Absolutely. You know, I came into this as a parent, you know, that really struggled with all the options available for my child, and they didn't work. And as a physician and a mom, I had to rectify that in my own brain. How do I move from something that's, you know, had maybe randomized controlled trials that have horrible side effects to something I don't know much about, but there's these, you know, anecdotal evidence on. And so doing that as a mom is one thing. You know, when it did work for my child and then I had other families approaching me, I had to think about that whole process. How do I make a decision about helping another child? You know, and I think that it's worth it to say these children that, you know, initially I'm working with, they didn't have a lot of options. You know, some of them were palliative, some of them, you know, were seizing and had no quality of life. So, you know, a lot of it was just discussions with families and not only, you know, just making it very patient centered and giving them the evidence we had or didn't have, you know, trying to figure out how to take the information we were getting and try to objectively follow these kids. So for example, I started with kids with epilepsy, and, you know, thinking back to my own visits with my own doctor, it was, okay, so how do we follow it? I'm a family doc, right? How do we follow a child with epilepsy? Okay, well, how many seizures are you having a day, a month, a year? You know, how is your sleep and all these things, you know, and then we got into autism and different things. And so I had to sort of figure out what the common threads were for each family and try to objectify it, whether it was self-destructive behaviors, days attended at school. So, you know, I tried to take all that and on the other side, try to put everything in milligrams per kilo to try to make it so that I could communicate with other healthcare providers. So, you know, I know this is a little bit off track of the original question, but it's very difficult, but we have to somehow bring it into some common language, you know, to try to take those anecdotal evidence, which now I've had hundreds of kids. So now, you know, I can say, okay, let's follow this, and this, you know, and we can see a change. So we're bringing it from the real world evidence into clinical. And I really found that the anecdotal evidence can help to tell us what to look for in the randomized controlled trials.
And so how are you as a clinician, and then we'll move over to the parents and I'll kind of ask them the same question, is how are you currently documenting that benefit? You know, how all that real world evidence, all that clinical data that you're gathering from these families, where does that go?
For me, I've struggled with having somewhere to put it. I've wanted, you know, some way like an app or something. And I've talked to various people about trying to create something for me that is easy to use. Parents can use it. They can enter their seizures per day. They can enter the milligram per kilo they're using, you know, that in hope that sometime we can take that evidence and we'll have it to look at, you know.
Give it to
So
people
that's-
like me who will take
Yes.
it and synthesize it and collect it from lots of different people. I think that's one of the challenges, right? Is right now a lot of that clinical data sits with the individual physicians, and that's hard to get access to, and hard to bring together. And so, you know, clinical data is collected the same way. I imagine you collect lots of your clinical data, but I wonder if we could hear from Alex and Matt about, as a parent, when you made this decision and you decided that this was something you wanted to try, how did you document your experiences? And is there any way that, you know, researchers and physicians could have made that easier for you?
Yeah, well, so from here, when I started out, it was basically Google. I was looking at Google, and that's what we want to change through MedCan, is to have a central hub and to try and make this research easier for parents, especially here in the UK. So we've teamed up with Drug Science, and we've already gathered data from 20 families. 10 have been published in the BMJ to show a 92% chance of being effective, which is huge in refractory epilepsy. Usually it's around 5% once you've failed the first primary medications available. And it also showed an 86% reduction in seizures, which is amazing. So that sort of information is really vital. And parents tend to keep seizure diaries, schools keep diaries. So myself, I have a seizure diary, but we predominantly rely on the school. Now Charlie's at school, he's with them most of the day. So you know, they record it and they keep a very close eye on it. It's currently seizure free, which is brilliant. So there are no seizures being recorded. But yeah, it's what you've just mentioned about the app. We're currently doing that as well. So we're now working with a third-party organisation, working with an app, and we want to gather more information from families and using an app. That data will then be passed to Drug Science to then report on. So it's that sort of thing that we're doing at the moment.
Excellent. Alex, did you want to maybe speak to sort of your journey? I know you've been in this space a really long time. So maybe you can talk to how it started and how it's changed.
Sure. Well, again, I guess I'll echo everyone else's comments that obviously the accumulation of data is super important. That's why I'm involved with C4T and Medical Cannabis Canada, because I want to do whatever I can to propel the research forward. When I started down our cannabis journey with my daughter Gwen was 2013. And apart from doing my own research, there was really no doctor that I found anyways in Canada that could really speak to me. Our GP actually gave us the prescription and basically handed it to me and said, that's all I can do. I don't know about this. You've convinced me it's not going to hurt her. Now, she was only 2 at the time. And obviously that makes access a little bit more difficult in the current regulatory regime, if you want to call it that. But, you know, same story as anyone else. You have to persevere, accumulate the data yourself, do your own research. And, you know, it's really neat to see, you know, 7-8 years later today, I'm having discussions with neuroscientists, epileptologists that are giving me good advice on how to change dose, maybe adding a minor cannabinoid to change the overall therapeutic potential, which was not available 7 years ago. So basically, I think it's important that the research keeps accelerating and hopefully get to those answers.
And over the 7 years, I'm assuming you've had different products that maybe have worked, or have you been using the same product? How do you track like what products are working for Gwen, or have you just stayed on the same product the whole time?
No, when we started giving her cannabis in 2013, there was no oil legally available in Canada. So I was getting a high CBD cultivar that was legally available. And then unfortunately I had to build a closed loop butane extractor machine in my garage, make the oil, have it independently lab tested, and then figure out dosing, etc. So when legal oil started becoming available to us, for many reasons, time, expense, messiness, I didn't want to continue making oil if I didn't have to. I tested 5 or 6 of the commercially available medical oils that were coming out and picked the one that was the closest profile to the oil I had been making. And we've stayed on that one for so far.
Good. That's great. And so maybe we can talk a bit about oils. I know one of the burning questions, and this one's coming to you, Callie, is about sort of isolates like Epidiolex and sort of purified cannabinoids versus these whole plant products. And sort of, obviously all of the complexities of the cannabis plant. And so I wonder, obviously when people find strains or cultivars that work for them, they want to stick with them. Can you maybe speak to sort of why cannabis as a plant is so challenging for drug development? If that's not too big a question.
No, that is a fantastic question. And cannabis, you have to ask yourself is why is the plant producing these compounds? So we've got the 144 different cannabinoids. We've then got the terpenes that are in there as well and the flavonoids. But why does the plant produce these? And these are often in response to some form of stress. So that could be insect attack, it could be herbivore attack. So it produces things that stop these actual attacks occurring and reduce that down. Also, there is theories that THC and CBD are produced as an actual sunscreen in the plant. So when you actually change the wavelength of light, you're going to change the ratio of compounds produced by the plant itself. So a slight change in environment can change the profile of chemicals that it's producing. So it makes it very, very difficult to actually keep producing a very consistent plant. And because there is hundreds, if not thousands of different compounds that are in different ratios with one another, and we can't analyze for every single one of them. We tend to only focus currently at the moment on THC and CBD here. We are becoming more aware of CBG's potential and THCV, but pretty much any product that is prescribed in the UK will only tell you the THC and CBD value. It won't even mention a terpene. That is just seen as a contaminant. But we then have to look at the extraction process as well, because that will alter the ratio of these and the compounds which are present, and then how old the product is, because it will then continue to metabolize and oxidize into other forms. So THC will quite happily oxidize and turn into CBN, which a product which you had at the beginning, at the beginning of your actual treatment may be very, very different towards the end. So you've got a stability issue with the product as well, which in the world of pharmaceuticals is just not acceptable whatsoever. As I say, the environment is one of the biggest things that does change the chemical profile of the plant. And it is unfortunate that that this occurs and makes it very, very difficult in order to do research on one particular chemovar because of these changes that can occur due to these stresses. Things are moving forwards, and there is more of an acceptance of compounds such as terpenes having the entourage effect. There are still many that don't believe that exists. There is still a school of thought that the isolates are the best way. Everybody has their own methodology, but why did the plant produce these to start off with? And that they work together in order to help the compounds work best within the endocannabinoid system of the body. So this does make it very, very difficult to actually do consistent research on any botanicals because it's a plant itself.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they don't listen to us when we tell them to behave a particular way all the time. And I think you brought up a great point about just the environment and the controlled environment. And the way we control the environments in plants is also how we control a clinical environment in clinical trials, right? So when we're trying to keep plants growing all of their compounds in the same sort of ratios, that's sort of what we're trying to do in clinical trials too. And we think about it is that we're trying to control the clinical environment and minimize all of that external stuff to get a clear picture of what's happening. And that doesn't always make sense, as you mentioned, for the cannabis plant that's going to be so different from batch to batch. And I think this is really a great place where observational data has a big role in what we need, I think. And maybe I'll turn this over back to you on to talk about just some of the strengths, obviously, with these challenges of cannabis as a plant, and just talking about, maybe what benefits real world evidence can offer and just why this is so important, and just a little bit about Project 2021. That would be great.
Thanks, Lauren. I think you actually, in your introduction, you summarized really, really well the benefits of real-world evidence. However, I'm going to try to put it basically a bit more in relation to medical cannabis per se. So one of the, within T21, the largest observational database here in the UK, at least so far, we've got now over 2,500 patients being from I think 18 to 96. Broad variety of conditions and a vast variety of medical cannabis products, from high THC to 1-to-1 to high THC and so on. So when we're developing really good evidence, basically, looking at everything, any kind of issues they might have adverse effects. And I think one of the key things that we're finding now, the project has been running 1.5 years, is kind of the importance first of longitudinal data. I think that's one of the things you might have left out, because RCTs can't really offer that, because you wouldn't actually get an RCT through regulators, I presume, if you say, oh, you want to run it for 2 years. That's not doing. And of course, a lot of the issues or potential issues with cannabis, with medical cannabis, such as fear of dependence, addiction, and so on, that's not really going to be seen in a fairly short-term RCTs. May be seen in a longer project. We have seen one case so far, so that's out of 2,500 patients. So I think it's proving to be very positive, but very important findings nevertheless. So longitudinal data, absolutely, I think is a key. The large scale data set, I mean, we would not be able to get that many patients through RCTs for the broad variety of conditions. And we've actually just had a bit of a look overall in terms of all the RCTs that have been done on medical cannabis for various conditions recently, and they don't come anywhere near in terms of patient numbers. And what Project 2021 is one of the databases. We have another one here in the UK. We have Health Canada has an excellent database, loads of publications already. There's a Minnesota database, French database. There's loads. So there's really thousands of patients that are available to look at, really. And one of the key things, again, as we're also seeing in T21, really, very loads of patients do not just have one condition, but most have comorbidities, some up to 10, which is incredible. So a lot of those patients would be automatically excluded from randomized controlled trials, just because it's too much to look in and there are too many kind of confounding variables in that regard. In a similar manner, a lot of the patients we see are using a variety of other medications to start off with, and it's not quite ethical to wash out all the medications before treating something, but rather than seeing, especially in terms of epilepsy, for example, the children. So it's you can't really do that. And then again, moving on to the cannabis medications, we have I think it's 10-20% of patients who are actually using several products of the cannabis products as well. So it's not always one product. And a lot of them, I think, was also, for example, some of them may have to change the product, and they react much better to one product than to the other, and so on. So that we are able to see that, and we're able to see it now for over 3 months, 6 months. It's just coming to that, and hopefully within the year we can see it even better and recognize a little bit what works for what condition, what type of patients, and so on. So all these things are just not feasible in an RCT for various reasons. You highlighted there are also loads of benefits in RCTs or with RCTs. It's just not that suitable for the data that we really need at the moment for cannabis. One of the reasons why I say need is because patients are using medical cannabis, whether that's prescribed product or whether, as is in the case in the UK, from the black market still. But patients are using it. So, we need to capitalize on it and say, okay, what are they using? How are they using? And really look into that. And an RCT, can't do that. And you also said, the time scale of RCTs, the immense costs involved and so on. And a lot of companies are not keen to spend that money, or it's just not feasible for them at that stage. So, yeah, and I think the other thing, obviously, that Callie highlighted in terms of botanical medicines in general, that this is also a problematic issue, which really, with real world evidence, you can actually take a broader perspective, and I think, and look at it, including these medications and the broad variety of compounds that they include.
I think one of the points that you mentioned about the multiple indications is really important, because I think that's something when we got into this space and this research, pediatric research group formed, I think we thought we were going to do trials. We were going to get money. We were going to do these great trials. And then we went, with who and what product and what dose and whose patients and how much can they, and we went, oh wait, what are people using and what do they want to study? And so I think, it really speaks to this, the taking of the observational data and how we need that data first in order to design clinical trials, because, we don't really know why patients are choosing the products they're choosing and what is working for them. So I think, I don't know if anyone had anything to add onto there. I know we have a question that came in about apps, about if there's any apps to look for. So I don't know if any of the speakers have any particular apps to look for. I know, Bruce, you mentioned that if someone's looking to look at their side effects, rating side effect profiles, there's obviously MEDRA coding and CTCAE, which is the common terminology for something adverse events, characterizing adverse events. I'm not quite sure what that second C stands for. But in terms of apps, I don't know if anyone wanted to speak to any upcoming apps, if you wanted to plug some of the work that you've been doing or answer that question.
So Strainprint is really awesome, and I've had just conversations with them about what I need for the kids in terms of inputting data, like myself, and they actually are developing more of their app as a caregiver app that's just rolling out, where caregivers can log in and document things that we want to know, objective things like I was mentioning before, but also then the physician can integrate it into their EMR, which is really cool too. So that's one I'm aware of. And they're all over the world, which makes it really helpful.
I was going to say, that's a big company that would be a good player. And I'm just trying to think of, once all that data, you have a good place for you to see your data, which is great. But can researchers access that? Can I access Jen's data and Bruce's data and bring all of that together in a common space? Is everyone calling the other question I have, and Jen, this will go to you first, is about consistency, right? So when you're documenting, obviously you're documenting all your patients the same way, but I wonder if you and, Bruce saw the same patient, are you writing, is that going to contain the same kind of, recording of how you record their exposures and their outcomes? And so maybe you can just speak a little bit to what data you are collecting on them.
So that's me. Okay. Yes, well, I think an app that's universal, that is willing to work with researchers and a lot of physicians, and that can evolve would be fantastic. So for starters, I've sort of reached out and wanted to develop an app that has the objective things that I want to follow, but have asked for that to evolve over time so we could try it, add more, and even add more researchers. The beauty of these is that it's universal. It's not just tied to my academic location, and so anyone can somehow enter, and the data can be shared.
Yeah, I wanted to, if I can, I wanted to second Strainprint. We have also been in contact with them, and they are very competent as well. And here from the UK, we have Alta Flora, which was, for example, the app that also Matt was already referring to, who are helping us develop a kind of patient-specific app for the families with epileptic children. And they've worked together as well as with some of our T21 team to really see how we can make it easier, basically, for patients as well as for doctors to input the data.
Yes, and I would love if all of your apps would talk to each other, because I have no hope for clinical EMRs talking to each other. So I'm just going to give up on that dream, and hope that there's some space for a cannabis app that could work for everyone. Alex, the app guy, I mean, I can't move on without asking if you have any other comments on the idea of an app that would work across a variety of indications.
Strainprint works really well. I know them very well as well. And I'm actually working with Dr. Burnham, who had an idea for an app. We're still looking for the funding and we're hoping to get it. But the idea of that app was specifically to act as a hub so that all institutions can plug in and have a centralized hub for the data to be mined out of. So I'm hoping that we'll get to that this year.
I was going to say an international database would be amazing for everyone.
Yeah.
You know, Australia, UK, Germany, Canada, US, everyone's just to be interesting and have a huge collection of pediatric, data across many conditions as well, not just epilepsy.
Well, and hopefully we can accompany that with like 25 pediatric clinical trials happening at the same time.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's the other side, right? Is once we have all this observational data, is then we have to, what are we going to do with it? And I think, especially in pediatrics, there's a lot of people whose minds aren't going to be open until they see clinical trial data, right? A lot of, a medicine's conditioned to look for these rigorous studies. And I think that, in the terms of, next 10 years, I hope that is something we can really work towards. There's another question that's coming in. Perhaps, Bruce, your jokes in the chat are hard to focus on the conversation here. Yes, perhaps this is a better use of someone else's $45 billion. I would agree. There's a question from Dr. Paula that says, do the panelists expect that the data derived from the different real-world evidence efforts around the world to aid in product registrations with regulators? Anyone want to tackle this question here? Bruce, you look like you're interested.
For sure. As I say, the problem is that data are data, and if you're in the realm of clinical trials, etc., and then basically my bread and butter, and I mean, in a classical world with classical clinical trials, your data have to be so specific, and if they deviate, then it corrupts your entire data set, and then you don't know quite what you're doing. We're not doing that with real world evidence. And so you actually have to reframe the way that you're thinking about what are the data. Everybody says, oh, it's data, but what are you measuring? So for instance, if, as I say, something that I learned is that if you're looking at a pain trial and you're asking somebody, what's the intensity of your pain on a 1 to 10 scale? And today it might be a 10, but you may have done some gardening yesterday and that's why it's a 10, but it's normally an 8 or whatever else it is. And just by taking your cannabis or taking your painkiller or something, that changes it. But how you perceive it is different because the weather may be different. And so if it's horrible and raining or whatever else it is, your pain may be off the scale, whereas you haven't done anything. Whereas on a nice sunny day in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, when your humidity is like 20% or something like that, you feel really, really good and you can do everything, but you haven't done anything else. And so your perception of your pain is different. So maybe what you're thinking of is, rather than saying, what's my intensity of pain on a 1 to 10 and has my medication or my cannabis changed that, is what's my quality of life doing that? Is this improving the stuff that I'm able to do on a quality of life? And so you change your scales. And so all that information that's coming in, you actually have to be able to compare your apples with apples and pears with pears, and at least have something that compares. And so you've got to actually have somebody who's in the United Kingdom saying, this is what I'm talking about with pain, the same as somebody in Sweden or somebody in the Netherlands or somebody in South Africa or Canada or whatever else it is, so that at least you can sort of compare the two. As I say, that's the problem when you actually really, really look at pushing all the data and the clinical trials together. You're not comparing the same things. And so we actually have to come to an understanding of how we can do that. And if we can actually do that, and then you can actually get some real world evidence to say, if I use this project, it may not change the pain that I'm in, but it changes the way that I can deal with it and cope with it. Then you can actually go to a regulator and say, this is evidence that this actually does it. The problem is that for regulators, are you having a consistent problem? The difficult thing is for a regulator is that this doesn't fit the normal model of a drug. It doesn't fit the normal model of a pharmaceutical or anything else. And so the amount of money that it would take to change it from a natural product to a drug is monumental, and they're not going to pay that. And so you've got to be realistic and say, this is not going to happen. But if we can actually get a recognition of a product that people are actually going to be able to get and to use, then maybe that's the best thing that we can hope for, which is exactly what Alex was doing. He did his own research, and then he's actually got a product that he made and he used, and then discovered that there was a product that was similar, and that one has stayed relatively the same, but it works for his daughter. And that's what you're going to have to do. Are you getting a product that is the best thing compared with an aspirin or a Tylenol or a paracetamol or whatever else it is, which you know what it is this the next best thing that I can get? And that's what the real world evidence is going to have to do. Again, the regulators, are they actually going to bite for that? We don't know at the moment.
Yeah. And at least here in Canada, I think, all of the things that we've spoken about today make it very hard to envision a DIN for a sort of a product that contains, all of the plant components. But your comment about quality of life, and I think there was another question about functional pain scales and how these work a lot better because they actually look at, how patients are, like how the impact of that pain, right? Because I think you make a great point about these clinical trials that look at all these fancy tools that really, are a little bit subjective and maybe don't necessarily reflect what's most important to those families. And when we think about cannabis and in pediatric oncology, for example, cannabis might be helping with their nausea, might be helping with their pain, it might be helping with their sleep. And that's why I think you make a great point about using, functional scales, using things like quality of life, because it almost takes into account that the benefits could be happening in different areas. And so I think that was a really great point. I don't know if anyone else had anything they wanted to add on.
To jump in, just regarding what Bruce mentioned about Alex. Here in the UK, because we only report on CBD and THC, we don't see the full ChemAval profile. So it's really difficult for us, for parents, especially like myself, is when I've had to change products in the past, you are blind. You are literally, even if it's the same ratio. So we've had parents use a particular brand and it's worked really, really well. Then another brand's come along, which is the same ratio of CBD and THC. They've administered that, or that's been prescribed. And then their children have gone downhill. But you're not seeing the full product, you're not knowing exactly. So Alex was able to compare and get have that informed choice.
Well,
to make that decision. Whereas here in the UK, we don't have that at the moment.
Let me just footnote that is that we technically have the same problem here in Canada. LPs are only required to report THC, CBD, not terpenoid information. Some do by choice. But the reason I had that information is I took their samples, took their lab data, then sent it to independent labs and paid for my own tests to be done. So no, most people do not have the ability to do that.
Well, LPs, because of the Schedule 1 licensing, we've only got one Schedule 1 lab here in the UK. So it's very, very expensive. It's very difficult for licensed producers to actually do this work and give that transparency. So us parents are having to do that legwork and send them off ourselves. And again, the consistency of them labs as well. How accurate is that test that they're doing? They don't always cover every cannabinoid. They don't cover every terpene. So you might not be getting the full picture. So it's really difficult at the moment.
100%.
Yeah, I can share an experience. Actually, I've been doing this for about 6 years with kids. And at the beginning, I went to the growers and I learned how the plants were grown and like the sound affected the plants and like the light and everything. I learned how to extract the plants. So I learned about all of the different cannabinoids and the terpenes and everything because my own son, I had tried to switch him from one to another and he'd start seizing. And I couldn't tell what was in these other things. But when I started seeing kids with epilepsy, there was one brand that really worked well. So then we gravitated to that one. Well, then that one all of a sudden wasn't available. And we literally had maybe like 20, 25 kids on it. And so we had this unexpected experiment of having to quickly switch them because this place was shut down and we didn't have anything that like any plan. And so we did, and we found varying responses. And actually it was really interesting because most of them gravitated finally to the one that was working really well. And that's actually the one I use the most now because as a parent and as a physician, I want to try the product that I have the most benefit with. But that was a huge wake up call in just trying to choose the right product for kids. And I wish we could go back and kind of study them all, but it was Very interesting. And yes, we only get the CBD and the THC. And actually through the years, when I've gone back to look to see, okay, why did this child go crazy on this one, but he's fine on this one? I could see the terpene profiles and everything, and I would screenshot them all. I have a lot of data on that. But now when I look, it's all like companies have gotten smart. They've gotten rid of them all because they're not required to provide them.
And
so sometimes I will call and go, I'm a doctor, I have these kids, I need this information. I won't use your product without it,
And that's something that we've been advocating for with the regulation changing, hopefully in the next couple of years here in Canada, is that this information, the reason why companies don't disclose it is because it can change batch to batch, of course, which for me is the exact reason why it should be publicly available. Is this is a product on the market that people are using for complex care needs, and we really should have transparency about how variable these batches are. So I can't agree more, and especially when we talk about kids, and maybe that's another thing to talk about is really, obviously most of us work in the pediatric space, and so maybe Matt, if you wanted to talk to just sort of what's different about studying cannabis in children, or in Alex, obviously you have a lot of experience here as well, and what is different about running all of these, both clinical trials and observational studies on cannabis with children.
From a UK perspective, stigma plays a huge part in that at the moment. We've got, we've only got one neurologist in the UK prescribing, so that obviously restricts it. But I think there's a lot of hesitancy from clinicians to prescribing and running trials. We've also got, so those that are prescribed whole plant cannabis and doing really well, you've then got the ethical side. Do you remove that and put in a placebo or changing products? So you've got the ethical side of things. We've also got every product, as Callie mentioned, is imported at the moment. So it's, from the randomized control trial perspective, are they really going to spend the money on such a small cohort of children that are currently being prescribed? So it's there's quite a few complications to sort of moving forward with trials.
Yeah, and I think that pediatric, there's not a lot of sick kids, thankfully, but that does mean that we have to work across country borders and jurisdictions, because we're never, we're not adult cardiologists where we're going to get, 20,000 patients in a clinical trial. These are always going to be small. And sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Matt. I would add one other point, I suppose, why I believe pediatric clinical trials are so important is a couple of reasons. Number one, in general, sick children are bad liars, and it's very, very unlikely that a 3 or 10 or 12-year-old is going to pretend that their pain is worse or pain is less, or that they're having less seizures because they like cannabis. It's just not going to happen. Probably, never say never. And I think the other important factor is that, especially with small children or any nonverbal population, such as my daughter, although it's harder to extract the evidence because they can't describe it to you, once we have it, and when you're dealing with concrete evidence like lack of seizures and an EEG, it becomes indisputable. So I think it's really, pediatric research serves a really valuable role in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't even think about the nonverbal part. But yeah, certainly. And that's a great place where family reported outcomes too can play a really central role on sort of the impact of the whole family. So we got another question coming in that says, I'd like to know if the observational real world evidence efforts are being used to identify promising products and cannabinoid combinations worth submitting to randomized clinical trials. So maybe, Bruce, you can speak to a little bit about sort of our space in Canada, and then Anna, I'll pass it back over to you to talk about the UK.
Thanks, Dr. Paula. That's actually very exciting because at C4T, we're actually planning and we're in the final stages of putting together a trial basically using real world evidence or based on real world evidence to look at a CBD and a THC CBD product to actually look at dosing and pharmacokinetics, so the amount of drugs that are there in somebody's blood and in their system. And I mean, we've based this because we don't have any of that classical pharmacological data to say this is what happens when you give this drug to this mouse model or this human volunteer or whatever else it is. We actually don't have any of those data because we're not using a pure drug. And so what we're doing is we're actually using the data and the expert opinion and the experience from the clinicians who are part of this trial to say, well, this is what I'm using in my kids who come to me with a brain tumor, or my kids that come to me with a relapsed leukemia, or my kids that come to you with a relapsed bone tumor, and this is what we found has worked. And so we're starting off at a base level and working up on a dose escalation to see what the side effect profile is, to see what the drug levels is, and to also see what the effect on somebody's symptomatology is. So not necessarily looking at their pain scale, but how this actually works with a whole variety of different sort of quality of life measures. So again, it's actually one of these almost like a real world evidence. So we're kind of blending the two. And I mean, the kickback has been, well, you're not using a pure product, so how do you know what you're doing? And shouldn't you be using this product here, which has a licensing? And say, but people aren't actually going to be using this. They're never going to use this. So the data that we get from this product is actually going to be useless to anybody who's actually out there, because you either can't get hold of it, or it's prohibitively expensive, or this is the one that people are actually going to be using. So why don't we use a real world product and actually use the information that we already have to design a trial to at least start that ball rolling, get some information into the cloud so that we can then take this forward. And this is where Lauren has really sort of helped to spearhead this. And there's a whole bunch of us across Canada who've come together to actually put this together. And really, I think this is very, very exciting.
And it was really also, Bruce, based off of a survey that we did with all of the pediatric oncologists, as you mentioned, like, you know, what patients are currently using cannabis and what products are they using? Because, you know, we thought, okay, maybe it might just be the retinoblastoma kids who are on treatment, or if we could tailor a tolerability study to who was using cannabis. And the answers we got were, it's a lot of variety. It's pretty much, you know, all different kinds of cancers, all different ages, off treatment, on treatment, you know, palliative, not. And so I think that helped us design a really very pragmatic trial, because it is quite broad, and then would go on to inform a randomized controlled clinical trial. So maybe the question there is also about sort of the difference of, once we have that pragmatic trial data, maybe it would signal that there is, you know, a company that wants to conduct a big phase 3 RCT and maybe go for something like a marketing authorization. And so, sorry, I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. And people really, thanks, Lauren. And people are really using things. So what we necessarily can authorize somebody to do is I can give you an authorization here in Canada to buy this much of a cannabis product, but not necessarily, I can't necessarily then dictate to a parent exactly which product they're going to get, because once you have your authorization, you can say, well, I'd like to change it around to something slightly different. And then you can sort of change the way that you're giving it. So some people are giving it orally, some people are giving it with food, some people hold it in their mouth for a long period of time to allow that absorption, some people are giving it rectally, and who knows exactly how this is working, what the levels are, etc., etc. And so the variability is unbelievable, and everybody is experimenting. Everybody in sort of the social media is talking to each other, talking to their friends, talking to other parents, talking to discussion groups. And that's where all that information has been coming from, that we don't actually necessarily have access to as the clinicians and researchers, because it's all out there. It's like the stable door is open, the horse is bolted, it's out there, it's in the field, and we've got to try and catch it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
One thing I've done, and I know it's interesting to talk to different Canadian physicians, but one thing I've done is really tailor my authorizations. So from day one, you know, this is the product, this is the dosing, this is how we're going to use it. So I think it's possible. It's just a matter of, when you're taking a patient that's already been using, then it's more difficult. But when you're starting a new one, you can be really specific. And actually, the LPs in Canada are very helpful, and you can write your prescription exactly the way you want it, and they have to follow it. So
just
before we move on, I just wanted to hear about Project 2021, and if there's any sort of mechanism to take that real world evidence and translate it into the design of trials.
Well, as I mentioned, we're working together with a consortium of industry partners and producers. So that is really, this is not something for us to decide, but for the industry partners at a later stage. We do see, for just as an example, where the majority of patients are coming to treat pain, chronic pain, and various other pain conditions. The second largest group actually is coming for psychiatric conditions. Firstly, anxiety, but also PTSD, depression, and so on. So we find that's very interesting with this. There are really not very many RCTs done on that. Absolutely. So we're getting an indication, which I'm sure most of us here on the call know, which kind of ratios, just in terms of CBD, THC, seem to be working well for that. But then, of course, once this is a little bit more developed, and we have follow-up data now for 3 or 6 months, as I mentioned, then the industry partners might well consider actually putting this through an RCT, their particular product or their particular ratio they're using. This is not something within P21, but we would be very happy if this comes to it, absolutely, because the evidence is quite, it's becoming more and more substantial. So it is very, absolutely relevant and very fascinating to see what actually comes out with. And we are hoping.
The point that we're still getting new indications for cannabis, I think, is really exciting, and also a challenge, because it's, again, I say every time we get on a call, we leave with more questions than we have answers, which is a little bit challenging sometimes. But I think that's a place where real world evidence really does give us some good insight onto actually what are the intention and why are people using cannabis products. And so with that, I'm just going to ask everyone, I think the same question before we leave today, which is really, what do you think the role is of observational research and clinical trials, and what do you think they will play in moving the medical cannabis field forward in the next 10 years? So maybe, Callie, I'll ask you for your insights first.
Well, hopefully we'll certainly move things here in the UK, because we are so behind. It is unbelievable. It's the only way that we can actually provide data that will be taken seriously by other clinicians. And Matt mentioned it, that a big problem in the UK, we still have a lot of stigma associated with it. And this kind of evidence and trials will hopefully help break down those barriers in the next 10 years, so that at the university, that lecturers, that researchers will actually accept that cannabis is a medicine, and it does have viability to be used. And hopefully we will start to see more products being licensed in this country as well, and then eventually go on to us getting a domestic supply. But that's wishing. So I'll let everybody else put their input into this and see what they feel, how things are going to progress in the next 10 years, hopefully for the much better than what we've got at the moment.
And hopefully fast too. Hopefully it doesn't take 10 years to make a little bit of progress. Alex, what are your thoughts?
I'll echo the hope to see much more research of all forms being done, from animal model to clinical trial. I think the more research that's done, the more we see onboarding from the generalized medical professional community, because they're becoming more comfortable, because the data is available, which is totally fair. I think the research can obviously identify pros and cons to cannabis across the board, which is good. And further help destigmatize from a societal perspective. And another thing I'd really like to see, and I'm hoping for, is some kind of an international consortium, which maybe will be us, that can somehow allow me to take my daughter's prescription medicine, get on a plane without seizures, and go visit my sister in England, or take her to a beach in Florida. So
absolutely, I'm 100% on board with that.
So, and much more.
Awesome. What else from you, Jen? What do you think in terms of observational data, clinical trials? Where do you think this is going, and how can we make them shake hands instead of arm wrestle?
And I'm really excited about the future. 6 years ago, when I was dealing with my son, and I never ever thought I'd be doing this, you know, the future was so dire. I felt helpless, you know, and there was nothing out there, and it was doors slammed in my face. And then when I started with kids, it was kind of, you know, one foot in front of the other, doing this, hoping I'd not get in trouble for helping these poor kids, you know. And I think what happened was, you know, there's so many families that are trying to explore cannabis after it became legal in Canada, and from hearing evidence worldwide, you know, and that created the demand for people like me to help these kids. And then when we started helping these kids, I saw the demand for research increase and the demand for physicians to pay attention, and the demand for physicians to not turn away anymore, and to actually start to have to deal with this, whether they wanted to or not. And here where I live, a lot of it is, Jen, can you please help me with this kid? I don't know what to do, which is totally fine. I'm glad, you know, but in doing that, now we've created such a community that, I mean, the families want the research. They'll be involved in whatever way they can to make it happen. And now that we're talking internationally, I think that the future is so bright, and we're going to have all this observational evidence that's going to inform our research, and then we're going to be able to develop, you know, randomized control trials, longitudinal studies, all these different studies, and in 10 years from now, we're going to be so far ahead.
And your point about randomized controlled trials kind of reaching people who aren't maybe listening yet, or, you know, it kind of gives them that in your face. You can't, you know, pretend that this isn't maybe something that could be a potential option. So I just wondered, just before I move on to the next person, if you had any ideas of, like, besides clinical trials, how else do we reach physicians who aren't maybe listening to patients and families?
Well, I have tried to use my own story, my own experience as a physician. Again, now with this documentary we've just produced, to try to create the conversation. And so I think that I've watched the physicians around me change their perspective. They may not help kids, but they are willing to play, and they're willing to participate. So I think that is just so important. So I think everybody has a role to play, whether you're a parent advocate, you're an educator, you're a politician. I put myself out to all fields of work, because I find that everyone, when they hear the stories, when they hear what's going on, they see real faces, they get involved and they get excited about it. And we need everyone involved.
There's plenty of work to go around, that's for sure. All right. So Matt, what are your thoughts? What do you see for this space in the next few years? What are your tips for our RWE and RCTs to work together?
It's basically just echoing kind of what everyone else has already said. It's here in the UK, there's so much stigma, and we really need to break that down. And the only way we're going to do that is through evidence, through research. So just more of that. And as soon as we start breaking down the barriers, that's going to open up access. There'll be more clinicians willing to prescribe. As I say, we've only got one neurologist here in the UK. And as Jen has mentioned, there is a community, there is a demand, there's a massive need. There's hundreds of patients that we support that are desperate for access to prescription cannabis under clinical guidance. So we just need to keep pushing, building the evidence. And the work that we're doing at the moment, so holding events, so the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society here in the UK, they're now doing a roadshow. We're going to be doing some advocacy work. About 50% of the UK population don't even know that medical cannabis can be prescribed. So yeah, that's a huge. So we've got a huge role to play there in actually getting advocacy out, making the awareness there. And also from MedCan's perspective, we're going to be holding events for patients to talk to industry, to talk to charities, condition charities, to make them aware that this is a thing. So we're all working together to push and drive forward research and to break down those barriers and that stigma.
Excellent. And Anna, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I can just reiterate what has been said already. And, obviously we spoke about the large scale databases, which are key and hopefully which can be persuasive. But I just, want to make sure we don't underestimate kind of the power of personal stories, be that from Matt and his family. And we have a big group, quite a big group, unfortunately, of families who experienced similar stories and who really brought forward the rescheduling of medical cannabis here in the UK. It might not have happened if these kind of parents and families would not have kind of opened their hearts and put the stories out in the news, and, who could argue with them. And that's not it's scientific evidence, but it's not the science that we're asking for or that the people are asking for, but it opened people's eyes. So now our job is really to continue that, but also supported by other evidence, kind of high level scientific evidence, large scale observational studies, registry. I mentioned briefly also the multi-criteria decision analysis, which is kind of an analytical approach, comparing, for example, how medical cannabis products work in comparison to other licensed products already on the market. We've done this in relation to pain. So this is science as well. So, you cannot really argue with that, but it's not RCTs. So, of course, it's still a challenge. But there are quite a few different ways, or in terms of, moving forwards with regulators, we're just planning a health economics analysis on medical cannabis and pain, and to really see in terms of the potential social and economic benefit what this has, because as you may know, pain is a huge issue in the UK as well as in many other countries with a large number of sufferers. And we're going to be looking at what social economic benefits would this have, in addition to obviously the benefits for patients and the families. So very much hoping that these different strands of real world evidence can come together and can be persuasive.
That's a great point about the cost. I think this is, as many of you, everyone on this call will know that these products are very expensive. And I think you make a great point about health economic assessment, because at the end of the day, we want governments to pay for these medicines for the patients as they would for any other medication. And in order to get that on formulary and to get that covered, we have to show that it is a cost benefit. That's just unfortunately sort of how these things work. And so one of the things that we're doing with our study is actually integrating a health economics evaluation. So looking at healthcare utilization. So for our kids, and don't worry, Bruce, I didn't forget about you. I'll get to in a minute. So for our kids, for example, we can look at their healthcare utilization, 2 years before they started the trial, and then look at them, they do their 7-month trial, and then look at them after the trial, and look at that healthcare utilization, but also looking at some of the data we're collecting. We have 2 clinical trials that are one that is about to start, and one, as Bruce mentioned, that is almost ready to be submitted, is looking at absenteeism. So looking at, did the kids attend school? Did they miss an event? Did they miss work? But also the parents. So did the parents miss work? Did the parents have to forego an event? And trying to capture some of that lost time and how that can improve, I think is really important. And so I know it's really important to us to build our studies with those health economics building blocks in there, because we know no one's going to do this separately later. So we're trying, as we design our studies, to consider that. And that's something we hadn't talked about today, and a really important point. So Bruce, before I ask you your thoughts, I also thought maybe you could also comment on, you're someone who does work in these kind of rare disease areas where there's not a lot of patients, and just maybe speaking to kind of that lens of how do we all work together in this space?
Sure. There's, as I say, there's maybe 3 things now that I'll speak to. So number one is sort of looking at directions of research. And I mean, I come from a very, very specialized academic background. I'm not a family physician. I'm not there on ground floor with there. So the kids that come to me have a lot of incredibly difficult diseases. They're seriously ill. They're critically ill. And so for a lot of my colleagues and places, people that are working in these children's hospitals and things like this, and people are coming to you, it's the directions are, is cannabis any use in these conditions? So rather than just saying, oh, well, it might be worthwhile having a try, it's actually people are going to want to say, is it actually going to be better than what else we've got? Is it going to work? Is it safe? And how much are you needing to give to it? Because really, those are questions that we don't have answers to right now. I mean, we have a lot of evidence from parents and families to say this is useful. And for a lot of people, it may be and it will be. But for a lot of others, it may not be. And we're just giving something just for the sheer sake of giving something, or we're giving the wrong dose, or we're giving the wrong product, or whatever else it is. But we really don't know that. So that's, again, what we want as those academic pediatricians and those physicians as well. The second one is looking really at sort of the education and the society aspect of this. As I say, what Matt was talking about in the UK and Anna, people don't know very much about it. And so one of the things that I'm doing with the students at the moment is actually reviewing our entire medical school syllabus to see where cannabis is talked about. And it's not. And so there's maybe one thing in psychiatry that says, oh, cannabis use disorder and that sort of thing, and the psychosis and sort of the side effects and stuff, but nobody's actually talking about where it can be used medically. So that's something to actually bring in, and to do research into actually medical education, to educate your physicians, your nurses, your nurse practitioners, your healthcare workers. So that's an important thing, but also to educate what people's society aspects are, what their knowledge about it is, what their stigma is about it. As Matt was saying, and Callie, is there is so much stigma out there, and that is political, not just anything else. I mean, it's been demonized for so many years, whereas other things have been accepted and embraced. And that has to change if you're going to look at this in a medicinal perspective. And then remind me, Kelly, what was the third question that you came out with?
Oh, just about, some of the other rare disease work that you do, and obviously the power of kind of networks, and sort of how you work in kind of these rare disease areas, and what we could learn in cannabis from some of the other, rare disease networks.
Absolutely. So one that springs to mind for me is that one of the diseases that I look after is retinoblastoma, which is a cancer of the eye, which really only occurs in children that are between 0 and 7 years old. So it's an incredibly niche speciality. And in Canada, which we have a population of over 35 million, we have 25 cases a year. So that's not very many. And so the numbers of people that look after that, you can fit very comfortably into a very, very small room. And so to learn and to do research on that, what we created was a parent and patient orientated research group. We call it CRAB, the Canadian Retinoblastoma Research Advisory Board. And really it's based with parents and patients who volunteer to do research to move this forward. We triggered and we came up with the 10 most important sort of items and issues that retinoblastoma families want to look at. And we've designed research around those, rather than coming from a clinician or an academic background and saying, well, these are the interesting things to us, we want you to help us with that. So we've flipped it completely on its end. And so we're actually generating research that is really, really relevant to parents, relevant to patients, relevant to families, and to really sort of move their experience forward. So that's maybe some of the things that we can do, but you actually have to get people like Matt, like Alex, like Jen involved in that, so that they can actually drive it from the ground up rather than the top down.
Wow. What a vision to leave us on. Hey, is this international network fueled by parents and patients and physicians and everyone's stories and expertise in clinical research. If there's anyone that has any final comments they want to add in for today. Well, Bruce, you really put us, I think, into a great visionary space of this international collaboration led, with patients and parents and families at the forefront, using outcome measures that capture sort of the whole life and less focus really on one indication. Lots of really great learnings today. And I'm really excited for how, this space changes over the next few years. I think with some of the observational work happening in Canada with Hans Clark's group and the Medical Cannabis by Shoppers project and the Project 21 project. And what we really need now is a mechanism to bring all of this data together and then hopefully incentivize some companies to invest in our new international collaborative and to run these clinical trials. So I do think they play an important role in how cannabis is used actually at the bedside, and also the policies that are going to govern it. So thank you everyone so much for your time and expertise today. Thank you to MedCan Support, and thank you to Drug Science for lending us your brains. And this webinar is recorded, so we did get a question about that. It will be recorded and it will be available on YouTube and on our website, which is www.medcankids.ca. And so with that, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending today from all over the world. And if you can pull up the final slide there, it has all of the contact information for the organizations today. So if you'd like any more information, feel free to visit C4T or MedCan Support or Drug Science on their websites. So with that, we will let everyone get back to their day, and we hope to hear from you and have some more content available soon. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. I hope to stay in touch.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.